You've noticed the signs that suggest interest. The avoidant person watches you when they think you're not looking. They position themselves near you in social situations. They engage when you initiate, but never quite initiate themselves. They show up where they know you'll be. They respond to your messages with more enthusiasm than their delayed timing would suggest. They seem interested, possibly even deeply interested, but they never actually approach. They never make the first move. They never clearly express their interest or ask you out. They remain in this liminal space of apparent attraction without action, leaving you confused about whether you're reading the situation correctly or whether you're imagining a connection that doesn't exist. This pattern of visible interest without approach is characteristic of avoidant attachment, and understanding why they haven't approached reveals the complex internal experience that prevents them from pursuing what they appear to want. The reasons for their inaction are not what you might assume. It's not that they're not interested enough, though they might tell themselves that story. It's not that they're waiting for a clearer sign from you, though they might use this as justification. It's not that timing is wrong or circumstances are complicated. Though these factors provide convenient excuses, the real reasons they haven't approached are rooted in the psychological mechanisms that define avoidant attachment. Their terror of vulnerability, their fear of rejection, their need to maintain control, and their tendency to prefer fantasy over the messy reality of actual relationship. The approach represents a threshold they cannot cross because crossing it would require them to make their interest visible and undeniable, to risk rejection and judgment, to move from the safety of possibility into the danger of reality, and to commit to action that removes their escape routes and forces them to follow through. Understanding why they remain frozen at this threshold, unable to approach despite apparent interest, reveals both the depth of their wounds and the impossibility of waiting for them to overcome their paralysis without intervention, because approaching would make their feelings undeniably real. The primary reason the avoidant person hasn't approached, the one that underlies many of their other justifications and fears, is that approaching would make their feelings undeniably real in ways they cannot currently tolerate. As long as they don't approach, as long as they don't express their interest or take action based on their attraction, they can maintain some level of denial or minimization about what they're feeling. They can tell themselves it's just casual interest, mild attraction, nothing serious or significant. They can convince themselves they don't really care that much, that they could take it or leave it, that this person is just someone they find somewhat interesting. This internal minimization of their feelings is a crucial protective mechanism that allows them to experience attraction without the full weight of vulnerability that accompanies acknowledging genuine interest. But approaching would shatter this protective denial. When you approach someone, when you express interest, when you ask someone out or make your attraction visible, you are making an undeniable statement about your feelings. You cannot approach and simultaneously pretend you don't care. The action of approaching is an admission that this person matters enough to take a risk, that you're interested enough to put yourself in a vulnerable position, that your feelings are significant enough to warrant action. For the avoidant person, this admission is psychologically intolerable because it means acknowledging that they care about something outside their control, that they want something they might not get, that they're experiencing a need or desire that makes them vulnerable. The avoidant person's relationship to their own feelings is characterized by suppression, intellectualization, and disconnection. They've learned through painful early experiences that having feelings, especially vulnerable feelings like attraction or desire, leads to pain. Perhaps they expressed interest in the past and were rejected or ridiculed. Perhaps they showed they cared about people who then hurt or abandoned them. Perhaps they learned that having needs or wants made them weak or burdensome. These experiences taught them that the safest approach is to disconnect from feelings, to minimize them, to convince themselves they don't really care that much about anything or anyone. This defensive disconnection has become so automatic that they often genuinely don't recognize the depth of their own feelings until circumstances force recognition. Approaching would force this recognition. It would require them to connect with their feelings enough to act on them, to admit to themselves that they want this person's attention and affection, that they desire connection, that this matters to them. This internal admission is the first threshold they cannot cross. Before they can approach you, they have to approach their own feelings. And this internal approach is too threatening. They would rather remain in a state of vague, unacknowledged attraction than face the full reality of caring about someone who might not care back, wanting something they might not receive, feeling desire that makes them vulnerable to disappointment. This is why you might notice the avoidant person seeming interested, but then pulling back or creating distance when you respond positively to their subtle signals. Your positive response makes their feelings more real because it introduces possibility. If you're not interested, they can safely maintain their attraction as a fantasy that will never be tested. But if you might be interested, suddenly their feelings become relevant and actionable. And the relevance is what terrifies them. They would rather maintain the safety of unrequited or unexpressed interest than face the vulnerability of mutual interest that might lead somewhere. The avoidant person's internal narrative about their inaction often involves convincing themselves that they don't actually want to approach, that they're not that interested, that this person isn't really right for them anyway. They focus on perceived flaws or incompatibilities. They tell themselves the timing is wrong. They convince themselves they're happier alone. All of these narratives serve the same function, protecting them from acknowledging the depth of feelings that approaching would make undeniable. If they can convince themselves they don't really want this, they don't have to face the vulnerability of wanting something and risking not getting it. This mechanism also explains why avoidants sometimes approach or express interest only when they believe the other person is unavailable or unlikely to reciprocate. When rejection is guaranteed or highly likely, they can approach because the approach doesn't carry the same risk. They know it won't lead anywhere. So expressing interest is safe. It's a way of acknowledging feelings without the vulnerability of those feelings potentially being reciprocated and leading to actual relationship. The approach in these circumstances is more about expressing feelings they need to release than about genuinely pursuing connection. And the unavailability of the other person ensures that the expression won't result in the intimacy they fear, because they're terrified you'll reject the real them. The second major reason the avoidant person hasn't approached is their deep terror that if they do approach, if they express interest and potentially enter into a relationship with you, you will eventually see the real them and reject what you see. This fear is rooted in the avoidant person's fundamental belief that they are not acceptable as they truly are, that the parts of themselves they consider authentic and vulnerable are the parts that will drive people away. They believe that if someone really knew them, saw their needs and fears and insecurities, witnessed their limitations and struggles, that person would find them unworthy and leave. This core wound around worthiness and acceptability shapes every aspect of how avoidants approach relationships. They've learned to show only carefully curated versions of themselves, versions that emphasize their competence and independence while hiding anything that might be judged as weakness or need. They present as having their life together, as not needing anyone, as completely self-sufficient and capable. This presentation is protective armor that prevents people from seeing the vulnerable, needy, uncertain parts that the avoidant believes are unacceptable. But maintaining this armor requires distance. The closer someone gets, the more time they spend with you, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the curated presentation and hide the authentic self. Approaching you would initiate a process that could lead to you seeing past the armor to the real person underneath. And this possibility is terrifying. The avoidant person fears that if you really knew them, you would discover they're not as together as they appear, not as independent as they claim, not as unbothered by emotional needs as they pretend. You would see that they have insecurities and vulnerabilities like everyone else. You would witness moments when they're not competent or in control. You would see them need things, want things, depend on things in ways that contradict their self-sufficient image. And the avoidant person believes that seeing these realities would make you lose interest or respect, would reveal them as inadequate or broken, would lead to the rejection they've been organizing their life to avoid. This fear of being truly seen and then rejected is particularly intense with people the avoidant is genuinely attracted to. If they don't care much about someone, they can risk being seen because the rejection wouldn't hurt that much. But with someone they're actually interested in, someone whose opinion matters, the stakes feel impossibly high. The more they're attracted to you, the more devastating your rejection would be. And therefore, the more carefully they need to protect themselves from the possibility of that rejection by never approaching in the first place. Better to maintain distance and wonder what might have been than to approach, be seen, and face the confirmation of their deepest fear that they are not enough. The avoidant person's internal dialogue around this fear often involves catastrophizing about all the ways approaching could go wrong. They imagine approaching you and having you reject them immediately. They imagine starting to date and then having you gradually lose interest as you discover who they really are. They imagine getting close and then being abandoned when their limitations become apparent. They imagine being vulnerable and having that vulnerability used against them or dismissed as weakness. All of these imagined scenarios feel so real and so painful that they justify the safety of inaction. Why risk the certain pain they imagine when they can maintain the ambiguous safety of never trying? This fear also explains why avoidants sometimes engage more freely with people they don't find particularly attractive or don't care that much about. With these people, the avoidant can be more relaxed and authentic because rejection wouldn't be personally devastating. They don't care enough about these people's opinions for judgment to hurt deeply. But with someone they're genuinely attracted to, someone whose acceptance would actually matter, the fear of judgment and rejection becomes paralyzing. They cannot be authentic because authenticity risks rejection. But they also cannot approach and maintain the inauthentic armor indefinitely because intimacy requires some level of genuine self-disclosure. The avoidant person's fear of rejection is also closely tied to their perfectionism and their need to maintain control. Approaching someone means entering into a situation where they cannot control the outcome. You might say yes, or you might say no. You might be interested, or you might not. Your response is beyond their control, and this lack of control is deeply uncomfortable for someone who has learned that staying in control is essential for staying safe. By not approaching, they maintain control over the situation. They don't have to face your response. They don't have to deal with uncertainty. They keep themselves safe from rejection by never creating the opportunity for it to occur, because taking action means losing the fantasy and facing reality. The third reason the avoidant person hasn't approached is that approaching would require them to abandon the fantasy version of the relationship they've constructed and face the messy, imperfect reality of actual connection with an actual person. As long as they don't approach, as long as the relationship remains hypothetical and unexplored, they can maintain an elaborate fantasy about what could be. In this fantasy, everything is perfect. There are no conflicts or disappointments. There are no incompatibilities or challenges. There is just the idealized possibility of connection without any of the complications that real relationships inevitably involve. The avoidant person's tendency toward fantasy is a defense mechanism that allows them to experience some of the positive feelings associated with connection while avoiding all the vulnerability and discomfort that actual intimacy requires. They can fantasize about being with you, about conversations you might have, about how compatible you might be, about how the relationship might develop. In these fantasies, they get to experience attraction and connection and even love without any of the risk that comes with pursuing those feelings. In reality, the fantasy is safe because it's entirely under their control. They can make you perfectly understanding of their needs for space. They can imagine you being exactly what they want without any of the complications real people bring. Approaching would mean trading this perfect fantasy for imperfect reality. It would mean discovering that you're an actual human with your own needs, limitations, opinions, and patterns rather than the idealized version they've constructed in their mind. It would mean facing the reality that relationships involve conflicts and misunderstandings, and moments when you disappoint each other. It would mean dealing with the ways you're not perfectly compatible, the ways your needs don't align seamlessly with theirs, the ways real intimacy is uncomfortable and challenging, even when it's rewarding. All of this reality is less appealing than the fantasy. So the avoidant person remains frozen, unwilling to trade the perfect imaginary relationship for the complicated real one. This preference for fantasy over reality is why avoidants often pine for people they cannot have, people who are unavailable or who live far away or who are otherwise impossible to actually be with. The impossibility protects the fantasy. They can maintain their idealization of these people and these potential relationships precisely because they'll never be tested by reality. But people who are actually available, people they could actually approach and pursue, are threatening because availability means the fantasy could become reality, and reality means the fantasy will be destroyed. The fantasy also serves another function. It allows the avoidant person to experience themselves as someone who wants relationship, who is capable of attraction and connection without having to prove it through action. They can tell themselves they're interested in relationships. They just haven't found the right person or the right situation. The fantasy of being with you confirms that they're capable of interest and attraction, which protects their self-image from the possibility that they're actually incapable of intimacy or relationship. As long as they maintain the fantasy without testing it, they can believe they're someone who could have relationships if they wanted to, preserving their self-image while avoiding the actual vulnerability relationships require. Approaching would force them to confront the gap between fantasy and reality, not just about you, but about themselves. In the fantasy, they're someone who can handle intimacy, who can be present and vulnerable, who can meet a partner's needs. But in reality, they know at some level that they struggle with all of these things. Approaching means putting their actual relational capacity to the test. And they fear discovering that they cannot actually do relationship in the ways they imagine in their fantasies. Better to maintain the fantasy where they're capable and you're perfect than to test reality where both of you are flawed and where their limitations would be exposed. The loss of fantasy that approaching represents is also a loss of hope and possibility. As long as they don't approach, as long as they maintain the fantasy, they can hope that maybe this would be the relationship that works. Maybe this would be the person they could finally be with. The fantasy allows them to escape the painful truth that their patterns make sustained intimacy extremely difficult, regardless of who the person is. But approaching and attempting actual relationship risks confirming that they cannot maintain intimacy, even with someone they're genuinely attracted to, even with someone who seems ideal in fantasy. This confirmation would be devastating because it would mean acknowledging that the problem is not about finding the right person, but about their own capacity. And this acknowledgement is too painful to face because they're waiting for perfect conditions that will never arrive. The fourth reason the avoidant person hasn't approached is that they're waiting for perfect conditions before taking action, conditions that will make approaching feel safe and certain rather than risky and vulnerable. In their mind, they will approach when the timing is better, when they have more clarity about their feelings, when they're more certain you're interested, when their life circumstances are more stable, when they feel more ready for relationship. These conditions function as moving targets that justify continued inaction. Every time circumstances approach what they previously identified as the necessary conditions, they discover new reasons why the conditions still aren't quite right, new factors that need to be in place before they can take the risk of approaching. This waiting for perfect conditions is a form of control and protection. The avoidant person is trying to eliminate all uncertainty and risk before taking action, trying to create a situation where approaching cannot result in rejection or disappointment or discomfort. But relationships are inherently uncertain. There is no amount of preparation or perfect timing that eliminates the vulnerability of expressing interest in someone. There is no set of conditions that guarantees a positive response or successful relationship. The perfect conditions the avoidant is waiting for do not and cannot exist, but waiting for them provides infinite justification for continued inaction. The conditions the avoidant identifies as necessary often include things beyond their control, which conveniently makes approaching impossible indefinitely. They're waiting for you to give clearer signals of interest, but they don't recognize the signals you're already giving because no signal feels clear enough when you're terrified of misreading the situation. They're waiting for you to be more available, but they perceive you as unavailable even when you're not because your unavailability protects them from having to approach. They're waiting for work to calm down, for life circumstances to be more stable, for some future point when they feel more ready, but there will always be some complication or uncertainty that makes the present moment feel like the wrong time. This pattern of waiting for perfect conditions also reflects the avoidant person's difficulty with tolerating discomfort and uncertainty. Approaching someone requires accepting that you don't know how they'll respond, that you might be rejected, that you're entering into uncertain territory. Secure people can tolerate this uncertainty as a normal part of pursuing connection, but avoidants need certainty before they can act. And since certainty is impossible, they remain paralyzed. They want a guarantee that approaching will result in a positive outcome before they're willing to take the risk. But wanting a guarantee before taking risk means never taking risk at all. The waiting also serves as a test of the other person. If you're genuinely interested, the avoidant reasons, you'll make the first move. You'll make yourself so available and interested that approaching feels safe. If you don't do this, if you don't remove all uncertainty and make yourself completely obvious in your interest, then maybe you're not that interested after all, and approaching would be a mistake. This logic protects the avoidant from having to take the vulnerable step of approaching while shifting responsibility onto you. If nothing happens, it's because you didn't make it safe enough for them, not because they were too afraid to take a reasonable risk. The perfect conditions the avoidant is waiting for often include being absolutely certain of their own feelings, being sure they want relationship, being confident they can follow through. But the avoidant person is never certain of their feelings because they've learned to disconnect from and doubt their emotional experience. They can be intensely attracted to someone and still not trust that attraction as valid or lasting. They can desperately want connection and simultaneously doubt whether they really want it or whether they're capable of it. This internal uncertainty means they keep waiting to feel more certain before approaching. But the certainty never comes because their relationship to their own feelings is fundamentally uncertain and self-doubting. The tragic reality is that the avoidant person's waiting for perfect conditions often means they wait until it's too late. They wait until you've lost interest from lack of reciprocation. They wait until you've found someone else who is willing to take the risk they wouldn't take. They wait until the opportunity has passed and all that's left is regret and the defensive narrative that it wasn't meant to be, the timing was wrong, it wouldn't have worked anyway. This outcome is psychologically safer for them than the vulnerability of approaching would have been, but it ensures they never actually experience the connection they fantasize about and keeps them trapped in a pattern of wanting intimacy while ensuring they never achieve it. The avoidant person hasn't approached because approaching would require everything they've organized their life to avoid. Acknowledging feelings that make them vulnerable, risking rejection of their authentic self, abandoning safe fantasy for messy reality, and taking action in the face of uncertainty rather than waiting for impossible perfect conditions. Understanding these reasons doesn't make their inaction less frustrating or less painful for you, but it does clarify that their failure to approach is not about you or your worth. It's about their wounds, their fears, and their defenses that prevent them from pursuing what they want. What their inaction reveals about the relationship's potential. The avoidant person's failure to approach, when understood in the full context of why they remain paralyzed, reveals critical information about what a relationship with them would actually be like if it ever began. Their inability to take this first step, to initiate contact, to express interest clearly, is not an isolated limitation that would disappear once the relationship started. It's a manifestation of the same patterns that would characterize every stage of the relationship: the fear of vulnerability, the preference for control over connection, the tendency to retreat when feelings become too real, the pattern of waiting and hesitating instead of moving toward what they want. If the avoidant person cannot approach you to express interest, they will struggle even more intensely with the vulnerable acts that sustaining a relationship requires. They will have difficulty expressing their feelings as the relationship deepens. They will hesitate to make commitments or take steps that increase intimacy and interdependence. They will pull back when closeness triggers their defenses. They will create distance when you need presence. They will struggle with every threshold that requires them to move deeper into vulnerability and connection. The same paralysis that prevents them from approaching you now will prevent them from showing up fully in relationship later. Understanding this pattern means recognizing that if you end up in a relationship with this person, whether because you approach them or because they eventually overcome their paralysis enough to approach you, you will likely become the person who does most of the initiating and pursuing throughout the relationship. You will be the one expressing feelings first. You will be the one pushing for progression and commitment. You will be the one taking emotional risks while they remain defended and hesitant. The dynamic that's being established now, where they're interested but inactive while you notice and wonder and potentially pursue, is the dynamic that will continue. This reality should inform your decision about whether to pursue this person yourself. Some people see the avoidance interest and decide to take the initiative, to make the first move, to do the approaching the avoidant cannot do. This choice is understandable, especially when the attraction is mutual and strong. But making this choice means accepting that you're entering a relationship where you will consistently be the more vulnerable party, the one taking more risks, the one investing more openly, while they remain protected and defended. You're accepting a relationship characterized by an imbalance in emotional labor and vulnerability from the very beginning. The avoidant person's failure to approach, when understood in the full context of why they remain paralyzed, reveals critical information about what a relationship with them would actually be like if it ever began. Their inability to take this first step, to initiate contact, to express interest clearly, is not an isolated limitation that would disappear once the relationship started. It's a manifestation of the same patterns that would characterize every stage of the relationship: the fear of vulnerability, the preference for control over connection, the tendency to retreat when feelings become too real, the pattern of waiting and hesitating instead of moving toward what they want.